How do I come to terms with that ancestral disappointment of when an ancestor that I hold near and dear didn't say the thing that I would have said, that actually says something that I feel is isolating, that actually says something that I feel is damaging to my other ancestors? Welcome, everyone. It is your host, Iman, and today I am feeling particularly grounded in the fact that I participated in my graduation ceremony, and I feel like I can say I'm officially a graduate and that I have a PhD. I actually got to walk across the stage and shake my advisor's hands and other faculty members in the department and have my family and my friends and my loved ones be there for me and witness that moment. And they went through such great effort to do so. And I can say without a doubt that I actually feel different after having participated in that ceremony. And it's like, oh, haha, scholar of religion actually feels different after a big ceremony and a big observance of a particular kind of ritual. And it's not to say that I didn't think I would feel different afterwards, but I thought because I've already finished my dissertation, I've already received my degree in the mail, that I thought that it would just feel more like checking something off the box rather than feeling like a particular kind of transition. And so I can actually say with a lot of clarity and a lot of certainty that after that ritual, after walking across the stage, I do feel a little bit different, and actually more than just a little bit, actually quite different. And how do I feel different? I just feel like I realized afterwards, oh, I have spent so much time thinking about who I am in relation to this particular institution. Yale University is where I went, my particular program in religious studies and Black studies, and everything that goes along with it. But now having crossed that stage, it really dawned on me that I no longer have to articulate or understand myself in relation to those entities. And it's not to say that those entities were not incredibly supportive of me embodying who I am and coming to my own voice and producing my own work. They absolutely were supportive of that. But there's something that just kind of feels like I have, for lack of a better term, graduated or transitioned from having to think of myself in relation to that institution. And so much so less to do about the institution and more to do with a sense of confidence that I feel now. I think there's something about having the people who supported you through it also witness this transition and mark to them and to yourself that you are moving on to something different, that you are officially doing something different, that this is technically behind you. And it just actually instilled in me a lot of confidence, a lot of anticipation that this does not feel like an end. This actually feels like a new beginning. I had somebody ask me if I was the first Black Muslim graduate of my program. I can say with like 99.9% certainty that I am the first Black Muslim woman to graduate with a PhD in religious studies from Yale University. And so I was just thinking about that, what my work represents, who my work represents, the kind of people and the kind of thinkers that I put in my dissertation that are now a part of this larger body of knowledge. And it made me feel deeply grateful for those ancestors, for the thinkers who I spend a great deal of time thinking about and writing about, and them and so many other Black Muslim thinkers and so many other Black women thinkers living and no longer with us, right, in the physical form. And it made me think a lot about how grateful I am for everything that they've left for us to inherit, for me to inherit. If they didn't leave these things, I would have never been able to do the work and do the kind of thinking that got me to this place that allowed me to walk across this graduation stage. And it also made me think, my God, like all I want to do in this life, I will have lived a good life if I can think to myself, I am going to be a good ancestor to those who come after me. And it made me think this kind of like preoccupation I've been having recently with my own work where I'm like, oh my God, is it going to be good enough? And it just made me think like, my God, I hope if I am lucky enough that a graduate student 50 years from now is going to be reading my work and tearing it apart. Inshallah, I pray, may I be so lucky to live and see the day that a graduate student reads my work, tears it apart, and tells me I'm wrong. Please, inshallah, I hope I get that blessing in life, because that will mean I have made something of substance, that I have put something out there that is worthy of both engagement, but also worthy of critique. And I'm certain I'm going to get their critique way earlier than 50 years. Absolutely. And I just think if I can leave the kind of thinking, thoughts, and forward momentum and the kind of movement, if I can keep being one step along a path that thinks about Black being through spiritual and intellectual terms, that sees spirituality, Black life, and intellectualism as actually categories that you cannot divorce, that you actually understand better when you think of these things all together, then I feel like I will have fulfilled my purpose of being a good ancestor and leaving something behind for others and for people. I think the world of thought, the world of thinking, the world of intellectualism, the world of spirituality is the space where I am supposed to put my proverbial breadcrumbs down, because I think so much about the proverbial breadcrumbs that others have left me, and I'm so grateful for them. This actually segues to a grounding question of the day, which is how to not be pissed off at your ancestors. Now, what do I mean by this? This is a question and a formulation that has come to me through two particular things that I have encountered in the past 24 hours. The first is I had no idea that people were going around saying, "Oh, I'm not my ancestors," in a way to distinguish themselves and their activity from what they assume to be a kind of passivity or docileness of their ancestors. A kind of critique like, okay, our ancestors didn't necessarily get us where I would want to be right now, or they wouldn't necessarily, knuck if you buck in the way that I would right now in this moment. I think that people who employ that phrase also don't actually do a lot of thinking with their ancestors. I think that phrase and that idea of this kind of passive, docile understanding of who our ancestors were, particularly for descendants of enslaved people in America, comes from a narrative that you are told about your ancestors rather than seeking narratives actually about your ancestors. It's also one that I think is marked with a particular kind of understanding of progress and understanding of change as being something that happens like a superhero movie where there's just one figure who stands up and then all of a sudden everything is changed. And there's certainly are figures like that in history and in Black history, ancestors who did stand up in those ways. But often a lot of our ancestors are, let's say, Black women who worked as domestic workers in order to provide for their families and put food on the table, who endured gendered, sexual, and racialized violence working in the homes of white people so that their children's bellies could be full. And that's not a superhero narrative if you want to think of superhero narratives like Spider-Man and Clark Kent, but that's certainly a superhero narrative in my mind. I think this phrase of, well, I'm not my ancestors is actually quite divorced from an actual deep thinking with and understanding of our ancestors and all the things that they did leave us, and how this kind of assumed understanding of this docile, passive slave is just put out into the ether without actual real roots and without actually taking the time to do thinking with real ancestral history, but also marking a really necessary reframing of how we think about action, how we think about quote unquote resistance beyond the myths of the superhero, or thinking about your ancestors as not doing anything for you if they didn't necessarily leave you with, let's say, material inheritances. But they certainly left you with spiritual ones. They certainly left you with intellectual ones. They certainly left you with metaphysical inheritances. I'm actually not sure that the person employing it has done really deep thinking with their own ancestral lineages or the ancestral lineages of other descendants of enslaved people, because you have ancestors that go beyond just those that are quote unquote blood related to you, right? I think that kind of disappointment of one's ancestors, of the people of the past, of what happened before your soul became into this world, I think that's actually something that is really worthy of sitting with. Now, I think that there is a really big difference from ancestral disappointment that is really different from necessarily disrespect. But I think it still really is a sentiment that's really worthy to grapple with. And I was reminded of this sentiment actually earlier today when I was reading a book and I was like, okay, I'm going to spend the day researching and writing. And then what I want to do the podcast on today, I'm going to let it come to me. And then I finally picked up this book that I've been meaning to read for a long time. It's called Spirit in the Dark by Joseph Soret, and it's a religious history of racial aesthetics. And it is basically a religious history of the Black literary tradition, and it looks at what he calls the spiritual grammars of essentially Black writers between the 1920s and the 1960s, really actually end of the 1960s. And he finds, right, religion and spirituality as being fundamentally important to a genre of thinking, that of Black literature, that is typically understood and conceived of as being secular, right? We like to see the Black literary canon as representing a particular form of Black secularism, and then the idea of Black religion as only concerned with the domain of theology and clergy. It's only your priest, your pastor, the theologian who are interested in thinking about themes of religion and spirituality. And he's saying, no, look, this whole group of people who we see as secular, that is Black writers, actually religion and spirituality was fundamentally important to how they thought about Blackness and what it meant to be Black. But in his research and in his investigation, he talks about how he wanted to find a spirituality that felt different than what folks like to call the standard narrative of Black religion. And that standard narrative, one being that is very church-centric, that is very Christian, and in particular is representative of a kind of Afro-Protestant formation. Meaning he wanted to find a spirituality that was different from the African-American religious history, canon, and status quo. He wanted to find a spirituality that was different from Black Christianity. And he talks about the fact that he didn't find that. Actually, he found that the spiritual grammars that this group of writers, thinkers, whether it be Toni Cade Bambara or Amiri Baraka, frequently just replicated in kind of Afro-Protestant, Black Christian, Black church-centric understanding of religion. But the experience of the scholar who goes looking in the Black radical tradition, in Black intellectual traditions for something, thinking that they're going to find something more transformative, more radical, more resistant, happens so frequently, in which you have to navigate for yourself how you're not going to be pissed off with your ancestors, right? How you're not going to be pissed off at the fact that thinkers who you love and who you adore and who have been transformative in your thinking in one way are not necessarily transformative in your thinking in another way. And it's not the same, but it's also related to that sentiment, right? Of, oh, well, I am not my ancestors. Both sentiments, whether it be in this more like kind of colloquial, everyday, vernacular sense, and then also in the pursuit of academia and scholarship and study, right? Where you encounter something from an icon of the past, someone who you adopt as an archival ancestor, as an intellectual ancestor, presents you with a moment where you're like, dang, I wasn't expecting that from you. I'm disappointed. I can think about this tons in my own work. You cannot study Malcolm X, right, without also confronting the woman question in his writing and thinking about women and gender. And of course, it transformed across his lifetime, but that doesn't mean I'm not still disappointed and confronted when I hear particular things. One example I'll never forget, I was in my very first Intro to Black Studies course. It was basically called Racial Formations when I was in graduate school. And one of the first texts we read was Anna Julia Cooper's A Voice from the South. This is considered, right, the start of Black feminist thought in Black women's religious history and Black women's intellectual history. And the opening scene or vignette of that monograph is Anna Julia Cooper basically saying, Black folks in America, you need to include Black women in the democratic process because you don't want to be like those barbaric Muslims over there, right? So we have this very first book in the Black feminist canon, in Black women's intellectual history, that is employing a kind of Orientalist understanding of who the Muslim woman is at the onset, right? That was disappointing to me. It was disappointing to me to be in my racial formations class, my very first Intro to Black Studies class as a graduate student, knowing I wanted to do this project on Black Muslim women's spiritual intellectualism, on Black women's spiritual intellectualism, right? And being introduced to this book, this very first book, as one that was presenting an already kind of Orientalist depiction of Muslim women, a kind of Orientalist understanding of who Black women are over and against the idea of who the Muslim woman was, and thinking, okay, wow, like I have a lot of work to do, right? But I'm also experiencing archival disappointment in, the archival ancestor herself, Anna Julia Cooper. So how do I resolve that in myself? How do I come to terms with that ancestral disappointment of when an ancestor that I hold near and dear didn't say the thing that I would have said, that actually says something that I feel is isolating, that actually says something that I feel is damaging to my other ancestors? How do I cope with that? That question is one that I actually had to come up with an answer to a while ago. And I think it's one that everyone needs to come up with an answer to. Of course, there's going to be a ton of different answers to how people handle ancestral disappointment, archival disappointment, intellectual disappointment of thinkers of the past, thinkers in the present. I have dealt with it in two particular ways. The first thing that I like to do is I like to ask myself, am I dehumanizing my ancestors? What do I mean by that? Am I holding them to a standard of ideological purity that negates their humanity, that they were not people capable of deep mistakes, but also people capable of deep change? I ask myself, where did I get the idea that people had to be perfect in order for me to respect them, and in order for me to think with them, and in order for me to learn from them? Because that's a standard I don't want anyone to hold me to. I don't want anyone who is reading my work 20 years from now to think that my thinking at 30 is going to be my thinking at 50. Inshallah, if I am blessed to live that long. My biggest fear is somebody reading something or seeing something that I posted or wrote when I was 21 and thinking that I have those same thoughts and I'm that same person at 31. So why would I treat my ancestors, who were people going through their own things, the product of their own socio-political contexts, as also not being deeply flawed? And that's not to be an apologist for things and discourses and thoughts that were done that were extremely harmful. Absolutely not. But what it is it's giving people the grace of intellectual flexibility, of intellectual maturity. If Anna Julia Cooper had lived to 2026, would she have written a new foreword to A Voice from the South that actually challenged and critiqued her own kind of Orientalist depiction of who Muslim women were over and against who the Black woman ought to be? I would like to think so. I don't know. But what I know is I'm sitting in this present moment, grateful for what Anna Julia Cooper left me to inherit so that I can do that writing myself. And it's not to apologize for that discourse, but it's to keep it moving. It's to see Black feminist thought as not beginning and ending with Anna Julia Cooper, or even beginning and ending with myself, but as a continuation. And that brings up another facet. And that brings up another important facet, right? Is also understanding that we are all people that are the product in the circumstances of material conditions that are not fully in our control. We certainly have control and can do things about them, but it doesn't mean that we all are not just out here trying to survive, right? Anna Julia Cooper writes that opening to A Voice from the South because she is trying to make sure Black women that she sees in her community, that she sees around her, right? And we're talking first generation out of slavery, people who were born slaves and liberated, right? She's trying to make it so that these Black women survive. So we have to see that we all are under survival conditions. If you are encountering work that is written by descendants of enslaved people, that is written by people who have been colonized, enslaved, kidnapped, dispossessed, we are all writing and thinking in survival mode. We're all writing and thinking in survival mode. If somebody comes and has my internet data, they're going to see, guess what? I have an Amazon account. I do. Am I proud of that? No. But I would hope that somebody can critique me for that, inshallah, one day when I am an ancestor and be like, yeah, this girl was talking all this stuff, but she still ordered stuff on Amazon. She still gave money to Jeff Bezos. Well, guess what? The medicine on Amazon is way cheaper than the medicine at CVS. So I'm going to order my allergy pills that I need to take every day from Amazon because they're way cheaper because I need to save $20 and I'm not a millionaire. But at the end of the day, I hope that people see that I am a product and I am working under conditions of survival. Right? There is no ethical consumption under capitalism and oligarchy, right? The racial capitalism that we experience. So we're all implicated in all of our consumption. But still, I hope that the people who come after me assess my actions, what I'm doing and what I'm saying as also the outcome of survival, the outcome of survival conditions. Another thing that has been really crucial to my own navigation of feelings of ancestral disappointment is not reducing movements to people's individual lifetimes, and two, not judging thinkers necessarily about where they were in the last moment of their life, but instead thinking with the fact that they made a decision to move in the first place. So what do I mean by that when I say not to reduce entire movements and entire schools of thought to individual people's lifetimes? That is me trying to resist a particular kind of Western historical narrative that folks call that of the great man, that understands history as beginning and end and being marked and chaptered and punctuated by great men's rise and falls, by individual men's lifetime. So for example, right, I am a scholar of Malcolm X, but I know that Black Muslim thought, the Black radical tradition, Pan-Africanism in the United States as we know it now, does not begin and end with Malcolm X. Absolutely was he 100% pivotal to Black nationalism, to Black revolutionary spiritualities, to Black critiques of capitalism. Absolutely. But it does not begin and end with Malcolm X, right? There was Louise Little before him. There was Harry Haywood. There was Marcus Garvey. There was Clara Muhammad. There was Elijah Muhammad. There's so many people who we do not even know their names, right? These movements were so big. If movements only were made up of the people that get written down in history, they would never be movements. Those would be a handful of people. They would never be movements. They would never be the kind of history, societal, cultural, political, transformative moments and movements in history if they were just reduced down to the people who are remembered in history books. That's just a handful of people, right? There is scholarship in American religious history that really challenges the idea that new religious movements, for example, are always popular because there's a single charismatic leader, when that model does not actually account for the other factors of success that are absolutely crucial. And those unnamed factors, those unnamed people, right, are frequently women, right, or frequently people who do not get to be put in the superhero role. So I mitigate my own ancestral disappointment when I encounter a thinker who isn't where I wanted them to be by realizing that the movement that I'm invested in is not reducible to their individual lifetime. That's not to say I'm not grateful for their thinking, absolutely, and that they're not worthy to think with, but I'm not going to reduce that movement, that school of thought that pre-exists, that school of thought that even pre-exists the actual naming of that as a school of thought, right? Black feminist thought exists beyond the actual codification and the actual naming and the actual term Black feminism, right? Anna Julia Cooper was not calling herself a Black feminist, but is Anna Julia Cooper a part of the Black feminist movement? Absolutely. Right? These movements exist on a continuum that exists beyond the individual lifetime. And so that's how I mitigate ancestral disappointment, by realizing they're not the only one. Because also, when I reduce that movement to a particular ancestor, I also mark the end of that movement with that individual's lifetime, obscuring the fact that many of these movements, right, the Black Muslim movement, the Black Muslim revolutionary movement is alive and well. This is a very Black revolutionary sense of time, that an individual lifetime is not the greatest metric of success. Who am I to think that where a person's intellectualism and spirituality and development was at the moment right before their death is where they would have landed and been had they lived 20 to 30 years, had they had a lifetime, had they had other kind of encounters that we don't know about. The second part of what do I mean when I say I do not assess the value and the intellectual depth and the necessity of ancestors based off of where they were intellectually and spiritually at the moment of their death, as much as I prioritize the fact that they were able to name their reality and where they were upon their birth, upon the awakening of their consciousness, being able to name things for what it is and make a decisive choice to move differently. I think there needs to be placed a greater value on how important naming conditions as is are, and the fact that one decides to leave those conditions behind and look in a new direction and imagine otherwise. Whether or not they actually get there, right? Whether or not they manifest what they are imagining in their single lifetime, right? I study Black nationalist thinkers who wanted to establish independent Black nations within the United States in their lifetime. Was that goal actually physically and materially realized? No. But it doesn't mean that it wasn't successful in starting something else, right? There's this amazing scholar named Edward O. Nancy who wrote a book called Free the Land, which is the first kind of like big definitive history of this Black nationalist group called the Republic of New Africa, who I've mentioned before. They wanted 5 states in the South to be given to Black people as reparations and to be the beginning of what would be an independent Black nation. Did 5 states in the South be handed over to Black people to establish an independent Black nation? No, but Edward O. Nancy doesn't want us to see the Republic of New Africa as not being successful. Instead, he says that they were successful and that they established what he calls an everyday new African lifestyle politic that put Black nationalist ideas into the cultural and the political ether that are still being taken up today, right? Are still being taken up to name a particular kind of insurgency and a resistance to this idea that Black people are actually citizens. That had we received the labor and the profit and the material resources of what we put into building this country, that we would actually decide to integrate within America as is rather than do something differently, right? So he has this amazing framing of not seeing them as unsuccessful in the fact that they did not accomplish this in their individual lifetime. Instead, he traces how the founders of this movement named something as is and imagined otherwise, moved in the direction that they wanted to go. Did they reach their final destination? No, but they named it and they moved otherwise. And so to me, that naming as is and deciding to move otherwise, to me, I find that is gold, right? That is so worthy and so important and requires and demands so much thinking with and thinking about. So if I were to only judge my ancestors on where they were at the moment before their death, if they had realized all their dreams, if they had become the person that I am, that I wanted them to be, that I want future generations to be, then I miss out on the ingenuity, the bravery, the imagination, the spiritual bravado, and just absolute daring, badass nature of things, of who they were, if I'm only focused on who they were right before their death and not the kind of courage that was needed in order for them to name the world as is and pivot otherwise. I hope that makes sense. I'm just like, because to me, I think that is where I'm at in my life, right? Is trying to name how things are and do things differently. And that takes a lot of bravery, right? And I think that is actually a fundamental part of all of life. I don't think you ever stop naming things how they are, assessing and trying to move differently. Under conditions of survival, I think that is always going to be a condition of our survival under modernity, right? So that's for me personally how I try to mitigate my own ancestral disappointment, is paying a little bit more attention to the beginning, the aspirational, the kind of everyday things that they did to move differently, instead of just being hyper focused on these certain kind of moments that are disappointing. It's not to apologize for them or to not recognize. For myself, I sit in that disappointment, but I don't let that disappointment be the primary feeling that structures my relationship with my ancestors. They were living under conditions of survival. I'm living under my own conditions of survival. And I hope that when people look back on my work and who I am as a person, that they also see me as somebody who is just the outcome of survival at the end of the day, who's doing what they can, thinking what they can, and also committed to my own becoming and my own development. That if I live longer, if I am here for longer, that I wouldn't be different than the moment that I am up into my death. And with that, I hope that you can return to those kinds of questions, those kinds of thinking about how you can humanize your ancestors, thinking about how you can not reduce entire movements and schools of thought to individual lifetimes, thinking about how you can pay attention to the moments of them naming things and moving in an opposite direction rather than just assessing them on their final kind of destination right before their death. I hope that also helps you all navigate what we are inevitably always going to encounter in this lifetime, and that is forms of ancestral disappointment. And with that, I'm leaving here feeling grounded, actually where I was finding grounding last week, in that I am going to mess up. I hope that 20 years after the publication of my first book, there's a grad student that is writing a so much better book on Black Muslim thought, totally critiquing where I was and where I was at. But I'm going to be so grateful if my work produces that kind of a conversation that allows Black femme spiritualities, Black women's religious history, and Black Muslim thought to continue 20 years from now, so that there are like 10 other Black Muslim women doing scholarship on Black Muslim women that graduate from a Yale in religious studies and continue that on. That will be amazing. And so I'm just going to say that as an Amin and inshallah for myself, and I will leave it there. If you liked this episode, Please comment, subscribe. You can follow me on all social media, on Instagram, on YouTube, on TikTok at IMANABDK. IMANABDK. If you have a listener question that you want me to answer on the show, please send me a DM on Instagram, on TikTok. You can also email groundedwithdriman@gmail.com if that is also easier. Watch us on YouTube. You're also hopefully now watching us on Apple Podcasts. I just got the verification that I can now be a video podcast on Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on Spotify, I'm just so grateful that you're here. And thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. So I will see you guys here next Monday. Bye-bye.